Good morning, good morning. Thank you so much for joining me. This is the podcast, The Endurance of Labor Laws. I'm your lovely host, Lesley Sullivan. Today is episode 211, and we are going to talk about the Bureau of Land Management, also known as BLM. I did want to discuss this one because it does involve oil and gas and quite a large bit of, I'd say, millions and millions of acres within the United States that is within the management of this federal agency, and how it affects oil and gas in our country. And I think this very much affects what is going on right now with lack of oil and gas production currently in the United States because of the current administration, and they do not understand the true nature of environmentalism and how to be self-sufficient and not have to rely on other countries. So that's one reason why I did want to discuss the Bureau of Land Management, because it's very interesting here. And plus they have a huge budget, way too big, way too big. Kind of not surprising there, but at the same time, it is a mismanagement of money when they're overspending. But before we dive in, let me give a big shout out to my listeners because we love to see you guys here. So a big shout out to Florida, New Jersey, California, New York, Virginia, Oklahoma, Mississippi, Illinois, and Texas. In terms of countries, the United States and Australia. Hey, good to see you guys. Okay, so a little bit of background information. This particular agency, under this name, the Bureau of Land Management, was formed December 10th, 1946, but it was a combination of a couple of different federal agencies to try and consolidate and streamline it. The preceding agencies was the U.S. Grazing Service and the General Land Office, so they combined those two to form this one, so that's good, so that way there's no duplication. The jurisdiction is the United States federal government, so these are not necessarily state lands. This is federal land. So, it kind of reminds me of when we were talking about the EPA, and sometimes the EPA would take people's land away from them. I'm trying to be nice about it, but they would try and say, oh, well, you can't build on your private property because it will affect the environment. So the federal government, via the EPA, was trying to legally confiscate and steal property away from private citizens who actually owned the property itself. And so it was very difficult sometimes for citizens to fight the federal government because, as usual, the federal government has an endless supply of money because of our tax dollars, and yet private citizens, sometimes it's very difficult to sue the federal government or to even fight them. So, but, needless to say, that's why we want to be sure that we don't over-empower our federal agencies. Are they important? Yes, for sure. I mean, it's like I've said in times past, with federal agencies as well as state agencies, almost every single one of them was founded for a good reason. And they were out there to do really good and to make sure that we are moving in the right direction in terms of our country and our states and our environment and things of that nature. And also security. I think security is a big thing as well. But here's the thing. Sometimes, and usually with big government, these federal agencies, they get too big for their britches and then they want way more money and they want to confiscate more and more and more from private citizens, and that is not the role of government because the government belongs to the people. Government is for the people and by the people. So it's one of those things that, the government is supposed to report to the people, not the people report to the government. So that's why it's very important to keep these federal agencies small and to make sure that they are continuing to be streamlined, not overspending and not getting too big for their britches. But anyway, this one is headquartered in Grand Junction, Colorado. They have a little over 10,000 employees. I thought they would have more considering what all that they do, but, this might be slightly outdated information here. In terms of their budget, this was kind of, didn't make me very happy, but I'm not surprised by it. As of 2021, or I shouldn't say as of, the fiscal year for 2021, their budget just for that year was $1.31 billion. And that's billion with a B. So that is quite a bit of money. And that does concern me there because that's a whole lot of money that can be used elsewhere. Because, I look at it this way. They're spending $1.3 billion per year. That's just the minimum. That's just the check that, Congress writes to them. And I don't think Congress should be doing that anymore. I think they need to at least cut that budget in half and really try and cut off the fat and really streamline these operations within these federal agencies because, that is our tax dollars there. It's not the government's money, it's our money. It's our money that is taken from our taxes, and it should be taken out of our wages because we should pay taxes, and it should go to the federal government. But what is happening is the larger these federal agencies get, the more they want to raise taxes, as opposed to trying to lower taxes and make things better for Americans. They just really want to make things better for themselves. Well, that's not really the purpose of government. I mean, that's the purpose of communism, fascism, and Marxism, but that is not the purpose of democracy or capitalism. So, and also socialism is, along the same lines of communism, fascism, and Marxism. So we want to make sure to try and steer clear of those things because it's not appropriate for our country. In terms of their parent agency, that would be the U.S. Department of the Interior. And diving into a little bit more information here, the Bureau of Land Management is an agency within the United States Department of the Interior, responsible for administering federal land. So quite a bit of territory there. I don't mean territory in like the literal sense. I just mean like it's a large area of land in the United States that these people are in charge of, so to speak. And so they're headquartered, as I just said, in Grand Junction, Colorado, and with oversight over 247.3 million acres. So almost 250 million acres, this agency governs it. So that kind of is a concern because they have quite a bit. Another problem that came about, or I shouldn't say came about, but was, I guess, acknowledged or kind of put a spotlight on it was, I can't remember if it was during President Obama's first term or his second term, but there was kind of a little mini scandal about how the federal government was sitting on all this federal property and was just letting it go to rot and ruin and was not selling it, was not leasing it, was not letting private citizens basically buy the land or produce any kind of goods or services on the land. They were just letting it rot, and that's not the purpose of federal government, and that's not the purpose of land management. When you're managing land, whether you're in the public sector or the private sector, you want what is best for the land, the environment, and more importantly, your people. But if you're just letting it sit there and rot, and decay, then it's not really doing anybody any good. But yet the federal government is collecting millions, if not billions of dollars to manage lands. It's not always managing these lands in the best possible manner, and that's where this gets to be kind of conflicting in terms of they say they care, but they're not really showing it, you know what I mean? But moving on, it says President Harry S. Truman created the Bureau of Land Management in 1946 by combining two existing agencies, the General Land Office and the Grazing Service. There are some things that change over time, some things do not. So, for example, there were two agencies that existed before this one came about, and they had been around for a while because there was a need for them. It kind of reminds me of the EPA, where President Richard Nixon, he combined several agencies, or how to describe this? He took several responsibilities from certain agencies and put them under the umbrella of the EPA and created the EPA. So that way there was not duplication, so that way they could actually get things done. Because prior to the EPA being created, which we have discussed at times past, there was a huge outcry from the public, both Democrat and Republican and maybe libertarians, whatever the case may be, that there were toxic hazardous waste sites in the United States, and that different federal agencies as well as state agencies were not managing these properties very well. Well, it's kind of the same thing here with these two different agencies, the General Land Office and the Grazing Service. They were combined to make things work better, not for things to be worse. And so I do think that they actually have accomplished a lot. It's just that now they are a huge agency and they're spending way too much money considering what they do. I mean, it's not like they're managing, all of the transportation in the country or something. You know what I mean? And even then, we just talked about, TSA the other day. Even then, there are some forms of transportation that are not governed by the United States. It's not governed by the government. It's private sector. And, within the private sector, you have to have licenses and permits and things of that nature. But typically, the private sector does a way better job of managing things than the government. And that's just been like that for a long time, which I think is one of the reasons why Harry Truman combined these two federal agencies into one federal agency. That way they would not have duplication, and that way there would not be competition. Because it's like what we discussed in times past with the EPA and some other federal agencies where prior to a new federal agency being created, there were several departments within the state or the federal government that it was just like the good old boy system, and they were having a constant pissing contest, and they were getting their feathers ruffled because like, no, that's my project, no, that's my project. Well, they were so busy fighting over stuff that they were not really accomplishing anything, and that's one reason why the EPA was created, was so that, yes, we can definitely identify these problems, but, what's the point of identifying an issue if you're not going to handle it? So that's another reason why these two agencies came together and formed the Bureau of Land Management, because if you think about it, the United States is a pretty large country. I mean, we're not small like Belgium or Spain or something. Nothing against those two countries. They're wonderful, I'm sure. But, the larger your country is, the greater the responsibility to protect your land and to protect the security of your country. So there is a big difference there. Moving on, it says the mission of this agency is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. That's a great statement, but it doesn't always come to pass. And one way that we know that is because of what the current administration is doing so that we do not have access to as much oil and gas here independently, I would say within the United States, as opposed to having to buy it from other countries that we may not really like or trust. And plus some of the oil that we're getting, I think, is from Venezuela or somewhere. It's either Venezuela or another country, and it's extremely dirty oil and gas. It's just extremely not good. It's overpriced, and it's just not the best way to go about getting what you need when you can have everything you need right here in your home country, which is what we should be doing. We should be independent, not dependent. Originally, the Bureau of Land Management holdings were described as land nobody wanted because homesteaders had passed them by. Ranchers hold nearly 18,000 permits and leases for livestock grazing on 155 million acres of the Bureau of Land Management public lands. The agency manages 221 wilderness areas, 27 national monuments, and about 636 other protected areas as part of the National Conservation Lands, formerly known as the National Landscape Conservation System, totaling about 36 million acres. So really large properties here, right? That's a whole lot of territory to manage. In addition, the National Conservation Lands include nearly 2,400 miles of wild and scenic rivers and nearly 6,000 miles of national scenic and historic trails. There are more than 63,000 oil and gas wells on the Bureau of Land Management public lands, but here's the thing, if you have not an agency, but a administration that is against any kind of drilling here at home, then basically that land is just sitting there not producing any oil and gas, and that is one of the reasons why we have inflation. That's one of the reasons why our oil and gas prices are so high in the United States. There's really no excuse for this to happen within the United States, because if we truly had a democracy and if we are truly operating in capitalism, then inflation would not really happen, and if it did, it would be minimal. Because see, here's the thing, within capitalism, you have consumerism. Well, if your government is preventing you from producing a product, that's not capitalism, that's communism. So, that's the danger of having I would say, an administration that doesn't understand that we do need to be independent, not dependent. So, there is a difference between those two things. Total energy leases generate approximately $5.4 billion in 2013, an amount divided among the Treasury, the states, and Native American groups. So here's the thing, our federal government, you would think that they would want to make as much money as possible, especially in tax revenue. But here's the thing, they're not really allowing people to do what they need to do and what they should do on these lands to produce oil and gas and products for consumers. And, the government is going to make money off of that. So you would think that they would want to do that. They would want to help our economy, and they would want us to be completely independent and not dependent upon anyone. But, that's why it matters so much who is in charge of what and why, because these things really matter. So needless to say, it doesn't make sense to vote for people that don't understand how oil and gas works, because without oil and gas, you won't be able to fill up the tank in your car. You just won't. And if you do, it will be very expensive gas. And I'll give an example. I was running errands the other day, and I drove past two gas stations, and both of them were out of gas. Like, I don't know, in the middle of the afternoon or something. And I just thought that was so bizarre, because that usually does not ever happen in Oklahoma. The only other time I found that a gas station ran out of gas here in Oklahoma was when 9/11 happened. And people were making a mad dash, so to speak, to every gas station to try and get fuel in their vehicles, because they knew that even then we were somewhat too dependent upon OPEC. And every single gas station in my hometown, and I think within Oklahoma City at that time, ran out of fuel because people, they freaked out and they bought up all the gas. So it really kind of concerned me yesterday or a couple of days ago, whatever, whenever I saw that, there were 2 gas stations that did not have fuel. And I just thought, that is bizarre, it is weird, and that always concerns me because usually in Oklahoma, especially within the Bible Belt states where we typically have oil and gas companies, and usually, I shouldn't say usually, but in Oklahoma, we either have very lucrative work or we have like none at all. I don't like that about Oklahoma, but that's just how it is. Texas, I think, handles things better in terms of always having consistent employment. But anyway, it's one of those things that whenever we have it really good here, we have it good. When it's bad, it's bad. So Oklahoma is not immune to oil and gas energy booms and then crises, I would say. So needless to say, Oklahoma, we've been taking a really strong hit in terms of oil prices, gas prices, as well as availability of fuel here in Oklahoma, especially for people that need to fill up their car. So, just think about it. If fuel is not as readily available, I don't like the use word shortage because I think that's very negative. But if fuel is expensive and not always readily available for consumers like you and me, then just imagine how much jet fuel is and how much fuel for them is not available, because jet fuel is very expensive anyway because it's a different type of fuel. And just imagine, if that fuel goes up and it's not as readily available, that price gets passed on to us, the consumer. So, just because, let's say, for example, you're a tree hugger and you think that less people should drive their cars, well, then just don't drive your car, but don't punish everybody else. See, because there's the thing. If you're for less fuel or gas or oil being drilled here in the United States or right off of our coast or whatever in the ocean, then all of that cost to actually get fuel here to be delivered into the United States, that cost is passed on to every consumer. It's not just at the gas pump. It's on everything. So for example, let's say, you are an environmental nutbag and you're a tree hugger, and I love trees, they're wonderful, but let's say you're a little crazy. And they say, I'm not going to drive my car anymore, I'm against fossil fuels, I'm just going to ride my bike everywhere. Here's the thing, you are still paying for high gas prices even though you're not purchasing fuel, because that high gas price is what truck drivers and delivery drivers have to pay whenever they are delivering the goods that you are buying at the grocery store for you and your family. See, that is the stupidity of these environmentalists. It's one thing to love and appreciate and protect the environment. That's a wonderful thing. We should all do that. But whenever you take it to the extreme, it punishes everybody. So that is a perfect example of where a political agenda supersedes common sense, and it basically destroys any type of consumerism. It destroys any type of capitalism, and it really upsets and creates inequality within democracy. That's why you have to be careful with these crazy ways of thinking where it's like, I'm going to be for the environment. Well, here's the thing. We are part of the environment. So if you're for people, and being that we live in the environment, this planet belongs to us, God gave it to us, if you are for people, then you are already for the environment, because we have to protect and preserve the environment. Otherwise, we won't have oxygen. Otherwise, we won't have goods. We won't have food. So, but however, when people take it to the extreme and they value a tree or a plant or a lizard more than a human being, that's where it gets to be disturbing and where policies do not make sense. And it actually hinders people, does not bless them. So that's where some of these things come into play, and how it can really kind of dismantle things a little bit, which I'm not a fan of that by any means. I think we need to stop dismantling things that work, and whatever doesn't work, we need to repair and fix it, but not just punish people for driving their car or for flying somewhere. You know what I mean? Fuel is fuel. We had the Industrial Revolution for a reason, and it's we can't go back to horse and buggy times. Because here's the thing, if you want to go back to horse and buggy times, then that means we won't have hospitals. That means we won't have antibiotics. That means we won't have surgeries. That means you won't have heart valve replacements. That means you won't have nursing homes. That means you won't have physical therapy centers. People really need to think about these things. You do not want to go back in time and relive what our ancestors lived in, because if anything, the whole purpose of being alive and moving forward is that you don't want your children to go through what you went through that was negative. You want things to progress and to be better. and to be lucrative and successful. But here's the thing. If you punish people for what they currently have just so that you can fulfill this false narrative of being a good person and being a tree hugger, then really you're just punishing people instead of blessing them. If you've listened to this podcast long enough, you know that I'm a born again Christian believer and that I believe in blessing people. That doesn't mean that I tolerate anything bad, not by any means. What it means is that you want what is best for others. And sometimes that means holding people accountable for what they do or what they didn't do, and also if they break the law. So here's the thing. Whenever you have politicians in office that claim to care about the environment, I guarantee you they do not really care about people, because most of the crazy politicians I've seen online that talk about the environment, they are almost always for abortion. Here's the thing. A tree is not more important than a baby. I would think that would be obvious. But see, here's the thing. There are so many environmentalist, liberal politicians that they've gotten on the bandwagon and have, for some reason, been brainwashed, sometimes willingly, that environmentalism is more important than human rights. But yet, they claim they care about human rights, but it doesn't apply to children. It doesn't apply to minors. It doesn't apply to teenagers, that may be sexually confused or something. See, that's the lie of liberals. That is the destructiveness, of their policies that they're trying to promote and pass in our country. And it's just, if something's not pro-America, we shouldn't do it. And hold on just a moment. Let me get a drink of water. But anyway, moving on, because I want to make sure that I get through all of this. Some of the programs that the BLM has, they have a grazing program, and this is for obviously livestock. And it says here the BLM manages livestock grazing on nearly 155 million acres. That's quite a bit. And that is under the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. So, here's the thing. Just because we have farmers and ranchers today, that doesn't mean that people did not know what they were doing in the past. A lot of what we have today in terms of legislation is built on a firm foundation, in times past, sometimes going back to the turn of the century, sometimes going back to the foundings of our country. So what's very interesting about environmentalists and liberals is they think that people from the past were stupid and very ignorant and maybe they were hicks or something, and that's not the case at all. So, it's interesting if liberals would just read the history of the United States and not be for obliterating and deleting the history of the United States, they would be way more knowledgeable. They would have way more common sense, and I guarantee you they would not be liberals anymore, because then they would actually understand that America is a good and wonderful country, and it is a beautiful country, not just because of the landscape, but because of the people. Because, whenever you have people in a landscape within a country, those two things go together. Because, people need a good country in order to have a good country. You know what I mean? So those things go hand in hand. But whenever you put, I would say, land or property or the environment ahead of, human life, that's when things go sour really quick, and it just doesn't make sense to do that, right? So another program that this agency has is in regards to mining. It says domestic production from over 63,000 federal onshore oil and gas wells on BLM lands accounts for 11% of the natural gas supply and 5% of the oil supply in the United States. Here's the thing. If the federal government or administration is not allowing people to drill, then that lowers greatly the amount of how much natural gas we have and how much oil supply we have here in the United States. So, for example, if you notice that your utility bill has gone up, this is one of the reasons why. Because the less access a utility company has to natural gas and oil, the more they have to try and seek out another source in order to provide electricity or gas to residents within cities, towns, or whatever the case may be. Now, mind you, I don't always agree with how they go about doing that, because I'm not a fan, really, of the electric company here in Oklahoma. What's it called? OG&E. I had to think for a second, because we have so many different electric companies here in Oklahoma, but yet the consumer, which would be you and me, we're not allowed to shop for the best pricing. So basically what happens is we have quite a few electric companies here in Oklahoma, but they have monopolies. And so they are given permission to be in control of certain areas of the state, but the consumer is not allowed to shop for the best pricing like they do in Texas. So that is a monopoly, that is illegal, it is immoral, and I don't like it. And so what has happened, I've talked about this in times past, OG&E, Oklahoma Gas and Electric, they have raised their rates, and I use the excuse, and I do say excuse because I don't really, it's not that I don't believe, 100% what they're saying. It's just that I know that they are for profit to the extreme, and I'm not against people that want to make money. I mean, I am a capitalist myself, but when you're messing with people's utilities, that's a big problem. Because, it's one thing to make profit off of something that people don't have to have. Like, for example, you don't have to have a bicycle. You don't have to have a coffee mug that says, I am the best boss or something. But gas and electricity, people have to have that, especially for the winter months and the summer months. So, that's not really an option. So, needless to say, OG&E, they sent out these emails, and I signed up for them. I'm glad I did, but they made the excuse that because the price of natural gas has gone up, even though I just have electric, I don't have gas and electric. Everything I have in my apartment is electric. But they made the excuse that because the price of natural gas has gone up, and natural gas is what they use as a source of energy to supply electricity or whatever, that's why they're having to charge more money for utility bills. Now, I don't really quite always agree with that because they also release, I think, quarterly reports, if I'm not mistaken, about how much money they make because you can actually invest in OG&E. You can purchase stock and things of that nature. I'm all for companies doing that because I think when you privatize something, it gets better. However, if you have made it so that you are the only company within a certain city or a certain area or region of your state, that's not capitalism, that's a monopoly. So that makes it so the consumer cannot get the best pricing, which is a big problem here in Oklahoma. In Oklahoma, I mean, our salaries are nothing like the state of Texas, what people make there in the private sector, unfortunately. So it's not like people can really afford to pay a whole lot more in utilities, considering that our wages have not really kept up with the I would say the cost of supply and demand. That's one of the things I don't like about Oklahoma, among other things. I mean, I love my home state. I was born here. But there are some things to fix and repair and to make better. Because I think instead of, going backwards and not having good policies, we should move forward. And whatever good policies work in other states, we should implement them here. So that way, I think more people need to make way more money. I'm not just talking about minimum wage. And I don't think raising minimum wage to like 15 or 20 bucks an hour is going to help tremendously because if you raise minimum wage, especially when people cannot afford a lot of goods right now, then that just makes the goods that people are providing or selling even more expensive. And then less people will purchase those goods, and then less people will be employed because less employers will employ people if the minimum wage has been raised drastically. So it's one of those things like capitalism works, over-governing does not. So that's one of the things that there have been some issues with. But another day, another podcast for that one for sure. Another program that BLM has is coal leases. And as usual, the Democratic Party is completely against coal, but coal is a wonderful source of energy. I mean, it just is. And if you get rid of coal, you get rid of a lot of jobs, and that's not right. And you are destroying an entire industry. So instead of saying, oh, it's causing cancer, which sometimes it can, depending on, I would say, the work environment, and if they have access to safety protocols and tools, just make it safer. But coal is still a really good source of energy. And so just make it a safer work environment, but don't take the jobs away, don't take the industry away, and don't take that energy away. Like for example, at one point in time, pesticides were really dangerous. But now we know what to do and what not to do, and now we have rules, laws, and regulations, licenses, and permits on the books of what you have to do if you want to make a chemical or a pesticide. And so we still have pesticides, and they are readily available, sometimes kind of too readily available, in my personal opinion, especially when they are, I would say, commercial grade. I don't think commercial grade chemicals should be sold to the public. I think that's a huge risk. I'm not a fan of that. And I say that as a Republican. I mean, I say that as a Republican capitalist. I think that people are too quick to spray pesticides anywhere and everywhere, especially in their homes, and I think that's ridiculous. But anyway, as long as you know what the danger is and you can circumvent that and, make it a safer working condition or have a safe working environment, then you can still produce the goods because they still do work. You know what I mean? Like, you just have to make it safer. The exact same thing happened in the Industrial Revolution. Like, way back then, we didn't have all these patents, we didn't have all these safety protocols because, at one point everything was new. Like, even the MRI machine at one point in time was new. A CT scan, somebody had to invent that. Maybe we'll do a podcast about that, because just think about, how many mistakes were made in the beginning. That's how it is whenever you invent something new, whether it is a product or maybe a new drug or maybe a vehicle. Like, I remember when electric vehicles first came out, I was like, I would never get one of those. Never. Because the person is not in control of the vehicle. Well, there were some problems with those electrical cars. I'm not surprised. Some of them crashed and the people in them burned alive. They were set on fire. And also they would get the road wrong or something, like the computer programming, or the car would like go 60 miles an hour right into a cement wall, whereas a person would not normally do that. But the computer and the car malfunction. See, that's the thing. Like, when the more control you take out of your hands, literally the less control you have. But it's one of those things, they have to work out the kinks. It's very unfortunate whenever there's loss of human life. Unfortunately, that's just what happens whenever you're trying new things. And sometimes, a lot of these things are invented. They're typically invented by people that think outside the box. They are very much go-getters, and they're very high-risk, I would say, behavior kind of people. Like, for example, this is the best example I can give on this, but, like, for example, when I was in college, and I was dating everything, the number one type of guy I could not stand to date was someone that was just always run by his hormones or adrenaline, like wanting to jump out of a plane, wanting to, race his car across the railroad tracks to see if he could make it and beat the train, like crazy stuff like that. I'm not a fan of that at all. But here's the thing. Like, for example, scientists and researchers, sometimes they have kind of that little bit of crazy thinking, hey, what if this drug could cure this? And here's the thing. That's why we have the drugs that we have. So, for example, like, there are some, I think, chemotherapy drugs that they can actually treat plaque psoriasis and other autoimmune disorders. Well, someone had to think outside the box, hey, whenever we're dealing with cancer and we're dealing with chemo, sometimes we're actually dealing with the immune system. So what if we could actually patent this drug, tweak it a little bit, so that way it actually helps people that have autoimmune disorders. Let's say they have lupus or, rheumatoid arthritis. These drugs have been phenomenal for those people. But here's the thing. If someone doesn't think outside the box, then no one's ever going to try it. See, that's what drug trials are for. So basically, whenever you join a drug trial, you're basically, you are putting your life on the line, but also, it could also save your life. So there are many things that are done that, I would say the average person would not do. But sometimes, if all the other drug therapies you have tried have failed, drug trials might be the thing for you. Because I've actually met some people over the years that they were in a drug trial and they knew the risk and they had to sign a waiver, because it is an experiment, But I mean, it's like, if you don't do a new drug, then your health's going to decline anyway, so you might as well try something new, give it a try, and it could possibly save your life. Well, the people that I have met over the years, the drug trials that they were in actually helped them and saved their life. So, I mean, there is risk in everything. I mean, there's risk in drinking too much caffeine. So it's one of those things that, it doesn't pay to be scared of stuff. Fear is just an emotion. So overcome the emotion and actually handle the problem. Because what some people don't realize, and this happens very frequently with liberals and Democrats, they just operate out of fear, like CNN, MSNBC, sometimes Fox News. But, the way that they make money is fear-mongering. Well, what if we actually had courage? You know what I mean? What if we actually gave people good news every day instead of bad news? See, I don't even watch the news hardly at all anymore. The only time I watch the news these days is whenever, there's bad weather here in Oklahoma and I need to know if there is a tornado coming. Because sometimes we'll hear the sirens, but the sirens, sometimes they go off, sometimes they don't. It kind of depends on, if a tornado has touched down or if there is, heavy thunderstorms, things of that nature. But it's one of those things, sometimes, a tornado can touch down and it may be far away and you have time to get shelter or seek shelter, or you have time to get your car and go to, another town where it's not going to hit. Other times a tornado touches down, you don't have time to leave your house. You barely have time to seek shelter and you just have to ride it out. So, I mean, that's just one of those things. There's risk involved just in being alive, but that doesn't mean that you're fearful. Basically, the way that we look at it here in Oklahoma is you have to take the bull by the horns, suck it up, make an adult decision. Even if you're scared, you have to push through it because that's how you stay alive. That's just how it is in so many things. I don't think I'm saying anything new. I think a lot of people agree with this because, here's the thing. It's kind of like that Kelly Clarkson song. I'm not a big fan of her music, but whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, whatever that phrase is, that's actually really true. And then there's a song by Beyonce. I'm not a big fan of Beyonce, but she has a song, I'm a survivor, I'm gonna make it, keep on surviving. I'm not a fan of that song, but I love the words. They're actually really true. They are really powerful, and I'm like, wow, I just wish sometimes she's a little trashy and a little ghetto. But I understand that sex sells in the industry that she's in. I just wish she could be classier about it because I think she is a good person. I've seen her in a couple of different interviews. I'm like, wow, I just wish she had a classier music style. Kind of reminds me of like J-Lo. Kind of off topic, but I'll just say it. J-Lo, there were a couple songs of hers that I liked here recently, so I looked them up on YouTube. And I couldn't even watch all of her performance because it was just constant twerking, her not being dressed appropriately, especially for her age, and she's a parent, she's a mother. And I just thought, wow, that is not appropriate for women, and I don't think it sets a very good role model for Hispanic women. Because I think, unfortunately, at least from what I've seen here in the Bible Belt, sometimes Hispanic women, they are notorious for dressing inappropriately because they are Hispanic. And they just have a different lifestyle. And I don't think that, for example, J-Lo is a very good mentor or a very good example for people within her race, especially for young women. It's kind of like the modeling industry. I remember when I was in middle school, I was like, oh, I want to be a model. I want to be super tall, super thin. Guess what? I've been physically fit for sure, but I've never been super tall. Like I want to be like 5'8", and that never happened. But see, here's the thing: the modeling industry makes it seem like if you're not super skinny, if you're not a size 0 or a 2, then you're fat. Well, here's the thing: I'm naturally like a size 6, 8, or a 10, depending on the clothing and depending on the fit, but depending on the designer. But here's the thing, the only way that I could get down to a 2 or a 4, and I did get down to a size 2, I think back in my freshman or sophomore year in college, but the only way I could do that was to exercise 3 hours every day, and I hardly ate any food. And I was like, this is ridiculous. I shouldn't have to do this. But I just did it as an experiment, because I was like, what, I'm sick and tired of being a size 6 or a size 8 or a size 10, even though that's what I naturally am. I am naturally muscular, and I'm not a full-figured woman. I wouldn't say that, but I am hippie. I am curvy, and things of that nature. But I just kind of got sick of it. Well, here's the thing. I can't change my DNA. I can't change how my body, looks like that. Like I can't change my bone structure. I can't change like where fat goes on my body and things like that. So I just tried to get down to a size 2, and I did. But, it was really interfering with my health. And so it's not healthy to exercise 3 hours every day, no matter what. And I hardly ate any food, and I lost a lot of hair. My skin coloring looked horrible. I was miserable. And my teeth started to feel loose. So, it's one of those things like, you have to be careful who you take advice from, who you look up to, and also, like, what are you trying to become? You know what I mean? That's just one of those things. So I think that, in regards to everyday life, I think it's important to remember what are you trying to do in your life and what do you want for your country? Because those things go hand in hand. It's not healthy for young women or any women actually to starve themselves, because how can you be who God, created you to be, and then how can you be a good citizen if you're not living the right kind of life? And I'm not nagging on women. Men can be just as stupid as well. I think if men, drink too much beer and get a pot belly, that's really bad. Let's go the other extreme. Like these gym rats or whatever, these guys that just overexercise and things of that nature. What they don't realize is that they can actually put a lot of strain on their cardiovascular system, their tendons, their tissues, their joints, and they can also get a hernia. So, you have to be very careful with your blood vessels and things of that nature, especially if you're doing steroids or supplements and things like that. Not really all that safe. So it's one of those things like, we have to be careful what we do in our lives, but I'm not saying be fearful. Of course, enjoy your life, but, do the best you can to be the best that you can be, so that way you can be a really good steward of your country and of your land and of your property. Because, like, for example, if you're not healthy and if you're not paying attention to what's going on in your country, then how are you going to recognize what's going on, like, for example, with these different federal agencies? Or you're not going to really be paying attention to inflation. You're not going to be paying attention to oil and gas prices. You're not going to be paying attention to people's wages. I mean, it's just, these are things that, as adults, we have a responsibility to care and to be good stewards of whatever we have been given. And so that's just one of those things that we need to be good stewards of everything that we participate in and everything we have been given. And that includes all of this, because you're probably thinking, where in the world is she going with this? Here's the thing. It's as they say, if you don't have your health, you don't really have much, right? I mean, let me put it this way, and I don't mean this harshly, but can you really fight for your country if you're in the hospital? No. And I'm not against people that are in hospitals. I pray for them. I pray that they are healed and happy, healthy, and whole, those wonderful things. But here's the thing, sometimes people put themselves in the hospital because they've lived a really destructive life and they've ruined their organs. They've ruined their body. So we have a responsibility to be healthy, to be mentally sound, and to make good decisions. I mean, isn't that what we want for ourselves and our leaders? Like, it all goes hand in hand. Like, it's not separate. It goes together. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party and these crazy liberal nutbags, time and time again, they have tried to separate these things. And the reason why they want to separate them is so that the government can control your property and control your health. That's why federal government wants control over so much property and so many acres within the United States. And also, they want socialized medicine. It's not the responsibility of government to be in charge of those things. It is not. So just please be aware of that and recognize that, the power is with the people, always has been, always will be. However, if you give that power to your government, it takes years, sometimes centuries, to get that power back. So just be aware of that. Okay, so another program that this agency has is recreation. So basically in regards to lakes, reservoirs, fishable streams, and things of that nature. And I think that's actually a good thing in terms of managing that, because unfortunately sometimes people overfish, and I don't understand why they do that, because it's just wrong. So if you are overfishing, please stop, because you're depleting basically our environment. Like, everything has a consequence, so please be aware of that. Another program that they have is conservation, and that is in regards to the National Landscape Conservation System, and it preserves a variety of lands protected from development. So basically, big businesses or even small businesses cannot develop any type of company on those lands. And so I would say, especially in regards to like national parks, things of that nature. So I think those things are important. Another program is the California Desert Conservation Area. And so that area covers 25 million acres of land in Southern California, designated by Congress in 1976 by means of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. The BLM is in charge, or is charged, with administering about 10 million acres of this fragile area with its potential for multiple uses in mind. So I guess they're trying to make sure that California, that the land does not get used and abused. And sometimes that's important. Sometimes they kind of go overboard, because hence it's California and they are a little crazy in regards to the environment. And let me get another drink of water. Hold on just a moment. So there are some areas in California that have been protected by certain people and certain groups, and I'm glad that they did that, but sometimes they take things too far, and that's where things get to be a problem. Another program that this agency has is in regards to the timberlands. The Bureau manages 55 million acres of forest and woodlands, including 11 million acres of commercial forest and 44 million acres of woodlands in 11 western states and Alaska. I'm actually very much in favor of that, because it takes a long time to grow trees. And I really like the policy that some companies have adapted, where for every one tree they cut down, they plant 4. I would raise that and raise it up to 8, because sometimes there are illnesses and diseases that trees get, and sometimes they don't make it. So I wish that they would increase that. But I mean, here's the thing. Way back in the day, I would say hundreds of years ago, our ancestors, they used to plant things more so than we do now. They wouldn't just chop things down and just like destroy the land, because they knew that, hey, if you want to have trees or produce in the future, you have to take care of the land. And so it's really sad that sometimes federal government has to intervene and say, hey, you can't be cutting down all these trees. You would think that people would be smart enough that, hey, if we don't have trees, we don't have oxygen. So we need to be very careful about these things. Another thing that this department handles is firefighting. I guess they have 3,000 full-time firefighting personnel that work for the Bureau of Land Management. The agency fought 2,573 fires on BLM managed lands in the fiscal year of 2013. So obviously a very important job. Another program is mineral rights on Indian lands. It says, as part of its trust responsibilities, the BLM provides technical advice for mineral operations on 56 million acres of Indian lands. I understand why we have Indian lands. I'm just not a fan of it, because that's having a nation within a nation. And Native Americans, they have their own tribes, and I don't think that's a good thing to still continue to acknowledge, because tribes have become very corrupt, and now they have casinos and banks, and I think that's a problem. And we've talked about the Bureau of Indian Affairs before in times past, and a little bit of the scandals, especially here in Oklahoma. And it has been a problem, because unfortunately the Indian tribes, at a federal level, I don't really know so much at state level, but at a federal level, they've kind of been given a free pass on so many things, and that's not right, because it's like they're citizens of two different nations, and that's not right to do that, because they live and operate here in the United States, which means they should be American citizens, but instead they kind of have a dual citizenship, sometimes multiple citizenships, depending on which tribes they belong to, and I just don't think that's right, because they're given a free pass on so many things that regular everyday Americans are not given a free pass on. So that's showing favoritism, and that's not right. And that very much is a problem, because, they wouldn't like it if we had favoritism, like non-Native Americans. Like, they would throw a hissy fit and sue us. So, it's like, okay, if it's not right to have favoritism on our side, then it's not right to have favoritism on their side. Like, favoritism and nepotism never helps anyone, because it always causes inequality. That's why I don't like it. Another program that this agency handles is leasing and land management of split estates. A split estate is similar to the broad form deeds used starting in the early 1900s. It is a separation of mineral rights and surface rights on a property. Now here's the thing, there have been some scandals with that here in Oklahoma, with some really shady companies trying to convince people to sell them their mineral rights, and then they don't realize exactly what they've sold. And so I think that's a problem, because I think that if you own a piece of land, you should also own the mineral rights, because it's your land, it's your property. But unfortunately, there was a separation of that, and I think that's caused a lot of problems, because I've seen that here in Oklahoma. If you've seen that in your state, reach out to me, let me know. I would love to have you on the show. I do know it has caused some problems, and it's very heartbreaking, especially for people that actually really need that money. And, maybe they're just living on Social Security and they need help. So, I'm not playing a violin, not by any means, because I don't believe in that. I'm just saying that, hey, these things have caused some problems, and it's really hindered some people here in Oklahoma, and I'm not a fan of that by any means. Another thing that this agency manages is abandoned mines. So they have an inventory of abandoned mines on the lands it manages. It says here, as of April 2014, the inventory contained nearly 46,000 sites and 85,000 other features, whatever features means. I'm guessing, like, if it's not a site, but maybe it's an area. So it says approximately 23% of the sites had either been remediated, had reclamation actions planned or underway, or did not require further action. So I guess it's one of these things, they have abandoned these sites, but they're not really sure how to use them going forward. Because I kind of feel like sometimes they're like Superfund sites, like they acknowledge that the area is abandoned, but they're not sure what to do with it, so it just sits there and rots. Well, that's not being a good steward of land or property, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican. So we need to make sure that we do things right the first time and correct things as we go along. Another thing that this agency has a program on, it's called Energy Corridors. I'm not familiar with this, but it says approximately 5,000 miles of energy corridors for pipelines and transmission lines are located on BLM managed lands. Well, that's all good and nice, but if you have an administration like what we have now that doesn't believe in oil and gas, but just believes in windmills or something, good luck with that. It just really sucks. Here's what people don't understand about, windmills and, energy that's, brought about by turbines or whatever. Guess what? If the wind doesn't blow, you don't have electricity. And those turbines are very large, they're very heavy, very expensive, very noisy, and they cannot possibly replace good old-fashioned electricity. It just does not. And I know from living here in Oklahoma, like sometimes we'll be going on a road trip or whatever, and we'll hear this racket, and we'll be driving through the country or whatever, and it's like, what is that? And we look off in the distance, and it's those stupid windmill turbine things or whatever. And it's like so obnoxiously loud, and it's on people's property. I guess the good thing about it is that it does provide some energy, but not enough for the state of Oklahoma. And then also, if the government or company builds those turbine things on your property, then they have to pay to use your land. That's good, but it doesn't really pay for itself though, because if it's not able to provide electricity for what we actually need in this country, then it's probably not necessarily a good idea to try and put all your money or all your eggs in that basket, because it doesn't necessarily work for everybody. Another program that this agency has is helium. Wasn't aware of that. But BLM operates the National Helium Reserve near Amarillo, Texas, a program, that began in 1925 during the time of, says the Zeppelin Wars. I'm not aware of what Zeppelin is. I'm going to look that up. So that will be another podcast for another day. It says, though the reserve had been set to be moved, to unanimously passed, this doesn't make sense. Though the reserve had been set to be moved to private hands, it remains subject to oversight of the BLM under the provisions of the Responsible Helium Administration and Stewardship Act, Stewardship Act of 2013. My apologies. It got cold again here in Oklahoma and the air is dry and I need more water. Hold on just a moment. Okay, hopefully we can have spring here soon. That'd be really nice. But I will make a note to look up the Zeppelin Wars. I'm not aware of that at all. And I'm not aware of the Helium Administration Stewardship Act of 2013. I will look that up. It's really interesting sometimes what the government gets involved in. The only thing I know about helium is that it's what it's typically used to fill up balloons. And if you inhale or suck in helium through your voice or your mouth, your voice changes and you sound like not a hobbit, but like a munchkin from the Wizard of Oz. So that's the only thing I know about helium. That's my knowledge there. So they also have the National Landscape Conservation System, and I guess it was established in 2000 and is overseen by the Bureau of Land Management. The National Landscape Conservation System lands constitute just about 12% of the lands managed by this agency. And it's one of those things that I'm a fan of it, but at the same time I'm not. I think sometimes we create too many things and then they cost a lot of money, and it's like, what is the goal? You know what I mean? Like we shouldn't have to keep creating these things over and over and over again. But at the same time, I understand when things become diversified and things come up and they need to handle it. I just wish it didn't cost billions of dollars. And I just kind of feel like sometimes federal agencies, they just overspend and it gets to be a problem. But in terms of some of the things that they are in charge of national monuments, and there are 27 of them. Then they are in charge of national conservation areas. They are in charge of 16 of those. They have national conservation areas that are similar, I guess, to the conservation lands. They are in charge of those, and there's like 5 of them, and it's about 436,164 acres. Then they are in charge of wilderness areas, and there's 221 of those. And it's a little over 8.7 million acres that they are in charge of. Then you have the wilderness study areas. There's 528 of those. It totals about almost 13 million acres of that. Then we have national wild and scenic rivers. They are in charge of 69 of those, and it's a little over 1 million acres that they are in charge of with that. Then they have national historic trails. There's 13 of those that they are in charge of. Then they have the National Scenic Trails, and they are in charge of 5 of those. And let's see here, in terms of what all they're in charge of with all of that, it's about 36 million acres. And in terms of miles, it's about 8,184 miles that they are in charge of. And so they also have their own law enforcement and security. I understand why they have that, because they do have federal laws that they have to enforce, and I think that's a good thing to do, because what's the point of saying, hey, we're going to be in charge of this, but then if someone violates what you are in charge of, if you don't have law enforcement to implement federal law, then there's really no point in having an agency. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of like having let's see. I was going to say the IRS, but well, it would be like the FBI. It'd be like having the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but yet it would be like if their law enforcement had no way of arresting people or just investigating people or having warrants or writs or whatever the case may be. It's kind of one of those things like, and I'm not for passing a whole bunch of laws, not by any means. I think, if anything, we have too many laws and regulations, and I think that's one of the biggest problems in the United States, especially whenever you have a Democrat in office. But here's the thing, if you're going to have a law in place or a legislation, there need to be consequences for people that violate those laws or legislations. Otherwise, it's just a memo. It's just a post-it note. Oh, please don't have a campfire whenever we're having a drought. You know what I mean? Or like, please don't hide the monies that you make, Wall Street or whatever the case may be. You know what I mean? Like, we have these rules, laws, and regulations for a reason. It's just that if they don't have what we call teeth to them, like if there's no repercussions, then all you've done is say, hey, please don't do what you're doing, and then they still continue to do what they're doing. So it is important what this does, and they do have, as we've talked about in times past within this podcast, these agencies, they typically have quite a few employees. So I don't know if these employees, there's a little over 10,000 within this agency. I don't know if they are within a federal union, but if they were, it would not surprise me. But I do know that if they have federal employment, they have excellent benefits. They have benefits that you and I do not have. And these benefits were protected by Obamacare. And so it's one of those things that they were given a special provision within Obamacare so that they would not be forced to be on any type of socialized medicine. And I think that's very crooked. That's a very crooked thing to do because, if the American people are forced to be on different types of health care because of Obamacare, then so should state and federal employees. But unfortunately, especially federal employees, they were exempt from so many things of Obamacare. Like, they were allowed to keep all of their benefits. You and I were not. I've said this in times past. 3 of my health insurance policies were made illegal over the years. The more Obamacare was implemented, the more difficult it was to find a health insurance policy that was affordable, that actually had a lot of doctors in the network, and that actually had medicines covered on it. Like, what's the point? What's the point of having a health insurance policy if you don't have access to hospitals, you don't have access to doctors, and you don't have access to the prescriptions that the doctors are trying to write for you? But yet, based on Obamacare and that stupid law, you are forced to have health insurance. Otherwise, the teeth, so to speak, and the repercussions of Obamacare, it was basically made illegal for you to not have health insurance. And so the teeth to that law was that you would be fined via the IRS on your taxes, and the IRS would come after you and penalize you for not having health insurance. See, that is a perfect example of where that law is completely and utterly wrong. It's unlawful. It's ridiculous. It's one thing to say, hey, we don't want you stealing boats or ships. Okay, we get that. That's thievery. That's illegal. But to not want or have access to a health insurance policy, or maybe you can't afford one, or maybe you work for an employer that doesn't offer one and you can't afford what's being offered in your state, or maybe what's offered in your state is lousy, okay? Then that law, Obamacare, was punishing you for not purchasing a product. The federal government, one of the biggest reasons why that law is unlawful, it's illegal and immoral, is because it forced people to purchase a product it's kind of like if the federal government was trying to force people to buy a car. You can't force people to purchase a product. It's a product. Health insurance, it's not a right. And that may offend some people, but we have discussed this in times past. Health insurance is not a right. It's a product that you purchase. It's a product that was invented in the private sector, and now that the government is trying to take it over, now they're trying to penalize people for this. So it doesn't really make sense to me. Because, health insurance, again, it's not a right. You have right to, go to a doctor and get health care, to be seen by a doctor like in an emergency room or something, but health insurance is not a right. It's a product. Rights are not tangible, typically. The only right I can think of is the right to bear arms, because, the right to bear arms is you purchase a gun, hopefully lawfully, but most rights are intangible. So, health insurance, it's a tangible product because, you go to a hospital, you go to a doctor's office, you go get your prescription refilled, whatever the case may be. But here's the thing, the federal government, they very much want to take over our health care. And here's the thing, health care that is managed by government is always lousy, it's always horrible, and if you need proof of that, look at what they're doing in the VA, Medicare and Medicaid. Look at what is happening with people that are on Social Security or disability insurance. Not insurance, but just disability in general. People on disability, they are forced into poverty. They're not even given a living wage. It's horrible. And then if they make any kind of money whatsoever, the government, kicks them off a disability. What's interesting is that just because someone that has a disability, just because they happen to make a little bit more money, that doesn't mean that the disability went away necessarily. You know what I mean? But unfortunately, our federal government, and sometimes our state governments, they make it very difficult to get help that people have already paid for. Like for example, if ever you have had a job, you have already paid into the system. Well, what sucks is that if you've already paid into the system and then you need help from the system, what sucks is when the system turns you away. That's not right. And I'm not for everybody being on Social Security or disability, not by any means. Not by any means. I'm not for that. I think it's a mistake because I think creating a nanny state actually hinders people from being successful. But here's the thing. If your government says they're going to help you, they should do what they say they're going to do. They should not hinder you and they should not force you into poverty. And what a lot of people don't realize or recognize is that almost all social welfare programs, whatever name you want to use, they keep people poor. They keep people poor. And here's how you know. The moment someone tries to have a better life, they get kicked off of their government program. See, that's not right. And I'm not saying that people should double dip. I'm not saying that at all. But here's the thing. People need a living wage. Well, what the government says is, well, you can't be on this program unless you live below poverty. Well, what's below poverty? It's pretty awful. It's not sustainable and it's not livable. See, our government thinks that in order to get help, you have to be almost dead or starving to death. Or you have to be dying. That's one of the requirements or one of the ways they look at with getting on disability. You have to have such a horrible outcome that there's nothing good in your future. And even then, they might deny you benefits. It's like, okay, every single one of us, we have paid into this system. So it's technically our money. It's not the government's money. But the problem is that whenever you put big government in charge, then they decide just how bad it gets in your life. That's not right. That is not how our monies are supposed to be spent. And I bring this up because, like, for example, this agency, the Bureau of Land Management, they spend $1.3 billion per year. Per year. But yet, these different government agencies that deal with people's health and medicine and disability and Social Security and the VA, they get in the way of people getting the proper health care that they were promised and that they paid for. But yet agencies like the Bureau of Land Management, they get billions of dollars a year. I mean, I just don't get it. Like, we have people starving in this country. We have people that are homeless. We have people that are mentally ill. We have people that need help getting jobs. We have people that need help getting access to their cancer drugs. I mean, this is what happens when you have big government. If we truly had capitalism and democracy, we would be way more successful. We would have less people that would be poor. More people would have access to what they need. Why? Because they would be in complete control of their money. See, here's the thing. Government, they want control over as many acres of land as possible, and then they want control over as much of our money as possible. That poses a big problem. Because government doesn't have your back. Because big government thinks that we report to them when actually they report to us, the citizens. That's why these things are so important. And here's the thing. Another reason why, I wanted to go over this particular federal agency, even though it's not a labor union, it matters because they're spending billions of dollars a year. Well, here's the thing. Regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican, regardless of whether you work in the public sector or the private sector, whether you work for a union or with a union or you're not unionized, our money is paying for this. Our monies are going towards this. And here's the thing, the bigger these federal agencies get, the smaller our paychecks get. And you might be thinking, oh, well, that's just the rich. No. Here's the thing, whenever the government goes after the rich, they're technically going after everybody. Because if rich people don't have as much money to spend, they're not going to invest in companies. They're not going to hire more workers. They're not going to give raises. Why? Because they don't have the money to do so when the government targets them in taxes. See, that's why these things go hand in hand. But yet, the Democratic Party, they want to separate these things and say, oh, well, these things are not joined together. These things are not, reliant upon each other. Actually, they are. That's like saying that you can separate a worker from their income. You can't do that. How else would a worker be able to file their taxes? How else would a worker know how much they make or earn? Like, it just makes no sense to me. These things are connected for a reason. Why? Because we are citizens of the United States and we have workers' rights that stem from the Constitution of the United States, as well as our Constitution of our individual states. Which, mind you, Texas has a pretty good Constitution. So that's why they threaten to leave, whenever they get a little pissy. But anyway, I'm going over time on this, but I will go ahead and end this episode. But as usual, until next time, I pray that you're happy, healthy, and whole, that you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Thank you so much. God bless and bye-bye.